All right. As a child growing up in America, I was taught that the Bible was the Word of God and an unquestionably accurate chronology of events in human history. Ken Ham of Answers in Genesis phrased it like this. He said, it's much like God saying, I know everything, I've always been there, here's what happened in the past. Of course, the Bible doesn't read that way. It reads like the man-made mythology of an uninformed deity in a jumble of discordant fables and human speculation with no moral or factual relevance. There certainly isn't any hint of divine inspiration. But because it was supposedly God-breathed, we're supposed to treat it as the absolute truth and the ultimate authority, even when it contradicts itself hundreds of times and has been shown to contain, as Mark Twain put it, upwards of 1,000 lies. Not even God can save the Bible at this point, because even if God exists, the Bible cannot be His Word. Not only does it not say anything that it should if a benevolent cosmic creator had actually written it, but what it does say is so wrong about so much that it was obviously not written by anyone who had any idea what they were talking about on any subject. The Bible is clearly composed and compiled by ignorant and bigoted superstitious savages and perpetuated by a culture attempting to assert their superiority and justify their inhumanity by pretending to speak for their God. I was taught that the Bible was the oldest book ever written and the oldest story ever told, or the first book ever written and the oldest story ever told. And if the Bible were true at all, this much must be true also, but we know it is not. There are many other works from already established religions that are much older than that. The scholarly consensus is that Genesis was compiled probably by Ezra from several unrelated oral traditions less than 2,500 years ago. Other documents filtered in at about the same time, all of which attributed to human authors, mostly between the 6th and 2nd centuries BC. The oldest book of the Bible that is not apparently adapted from previous polytheism is the book of Job, and it hails from around 1500 BC. That's still centuries younger than the Rig Veda, the eldest of the Vedic scriptures, typically dated from 1700 to 1900 BC, which makes Hinduism the oldest religion in continuous practice. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest archaeological texts known for the basis of Rabbinic Judaism, being radiocarbon dated to between 335 BC and 122 BC, but relating to events from the 7th century BC. Curiously, Zoroastrian, Buddhist, Hindu, Hellenist, Druidic, Chinese, and Egyptian religions all either began in the 7th century BC or they endured major revisions at around this time. For example, this is where we get the Avestas of Zarathustra, this is where they dated the current version of the Bhagavad Gita, and this is when Lao Tzu wrote the Tao Te Ching. This flowering of philosophies also included atheism and the emergence of scientific naturalism among Ionian Greeks of the same period. Here in the United States, a lot of people still believe that the beginning of time was only around 6,000 years ago. This estimate is based solely on the poor mathematics of a monk from the 18th century, extrapolating assumptions with no other information than a single source, a sacred storybook. The entirety of modern scholarship in every relevant field, everything we know about history, archaeology, geology, anthropology, and even ancient mythology, from experts around the world, show that this misinformed monk was wrong. The migrations of men have been charted using genomics atop all these other fields, as well as the radiometric dating of excavated artifacts. And we now know for certain that 6,000 years ago, and for a long time before then, Native Americans were already widely dispersed on both American continents. Aborigines were already in Australia, and there were already complex civilizations established across the Orient, in India, and North Africa, and emerging in the Middle East. The ancestors of each of the cultural demes in all these locations were already there way back then, and they already spoke many different languages because it is possible to track the evolution of language too. Reading the literature of antiquity, it is easy enough to see all the transitions showing how Latin evolved into Spanish and French and Italian, for example. It's also impossible to trace the influx of new words or contractions to show similar trends without having necessarily all of the literature to show when languages evolve similar patterns in that language and also in the Indian languages and the Avestas and so on. Just like tracing mutations in an evolving genome. So what about this Tower of Babel, where all these original languages were supposed to come from? That story is literally legendary. The biblical account isn't true at all, but it is based on a kernel of truth. The unfinished Tower of Babylon still exists and is still visible from the site of the original city. It was begun by Hammurabi around 1750 BC, and it was originally dedicated to Marduk, one of the elder gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon. The project was resumed in the next millennia by King Nebuchadnezzar, and eventually abandoned a second time, but it's the reason that it abandoned the first time that provides a parallel for the parable. It seems that the shifting kingdoms of Sumer, Babylon, Akkad, and Chaldea once boasted and shared the earliest syllabic text ever invented. They lived in sophisticated city-states. They sent their children to formal schools where they were taught how to read and write in cuneiform. This was a special tool made for pressing letters of a sort into clay tablets, which were then baked into permanent documents. These people were fully literate until the fall of the Mesopotamian Empire, or in this case Hammurabi's portion of that. Then the schools were closed, public education was abandoned, and soon no one could read cuneiform anymore. This would have been roughly concordant with Hammurabi's initial construction of the Marduk ziggurat, which was seemingly rededicated under Nebuchadnezzar and is now more popularly known as the Tower of Babel. The base of the tower is still there, but otherwise the loss of literacy may be the only element of truth that fable has. And this is the important part. For after all the schools were closed, the stories were kept alive by memorization and rehearsal. It does not matter how true to the word you try to be. Subtle changes will occasionally or eventually occur with this process, either in translation or interpretation, and both of these still happen all the time, even when the Bible was written down in supposedly indelible ink again. That's why we have myriad denominations, despite their devotion to an allegedly unchanging word, and regardless of our enlightenment and access to information otherwise. So imagine what it was like back in the Bronze Age, when they were no longer set in stone. These originally unrelated legends of these collective people were more readily subject to embellishment and cultural integration. For several centuries this went on, with each generation passing these stories on to the next. That's all right, it was tense in here anyway. By the time the Phoenicians reinvented syllabic texts around the 10th century BC, all the elder legends had evidently evolved, being enhanced, exaggerated, or otherwise influenced by neighboring religions and political dynamics. Some experts now recognize 4 sources just for the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. According to the Wellhausen documentary hypothesis, these forgotten contributors are now referred to as the Yahwists from 950 BC in the southern kingdom of Judah, the Elohists from 850 BC in the northern kingdom of Israel, the Deuteronomists from 600 BC in Jerusalem during a period of religious reform, and the priestly writers, and this would include Ezra. These were the Jewish priests in exile in Babylon. Modern scholarship doesn't credit Moses as the author of anything. One reason is that Moses couldn't possibly have posthumously written about his own death and remembrance as detailed in Deuteronomy. And worse, Moses evidently never even existed as described. As folklore changes over time and is filtered through different tribal demes, very often the names of even central characters are changed. Just as Rome has different names for the gods and heroes of the same myths as they have in Greece, the same thing happens in ancient Semitic mythology too. For example, it seems that the character now known as Moses is actually a compilation of a few different predecessors from elder mythos. The most obvious of these is Hammurabi, the Babylonian lawgiver. He received the stele of law from the sun god Shamash some 500 years before Moses was supposed to have lived, which is typically estimated to be around 1250 BC. Otherwise, the principal difference between these two figures is that the stele of law is an actual obelisk standing 8 feet high and on display in the London Museum, while the Ark of the Covenant is one of those things that seems to only exist in movies. Egypt provided another precursor in the form of Jajamek, the ritual priest for the pharaoh Senefru from the 4th dynasty in the Old Kingdom in the 25th century BC. One of the 5 tales included in the Westcar Papyrus details a voyage wherein Snefru took a score of buxom, beautiful young girls, stripped them all naked, and put them on his longboat so that he could watch the view as they row across the lake.
Who wouldn't do that?
It's good to be the king. One of these girls accidentally dropped a bauble of turquoise over the side and became so upset about it that Snefru called for Judgemank, which is priestly mage, and Judgemank cast a spell that took the lake and folded it over itself, like looking under a blanket, so that Snefru could gather the turquoise bauble and become a hero to a topless slave maiden. Okay, so it's not quite Cecil B. DeMille. But it does cause one to wonder how the story of Moses parting the Red Sea could have been that significant in the same land where they had already written up this satirical farce well more than 1,000 years earlier. And I thought the original story was better. In their book, Deceptions and Myths of the Bible, Lloyd and Elizabeth Graham describe parallels between the stories of Moses and Sargon. Reading now, the myth woven about the legendary Sargon I, 2750 BC, strikingly resembles early history of Moses, that is, his infancy. This part is given only by the Elohist. When she, Moses' mother, could no longer hide him, she took him for an ark of bulrushes and daubed it with slime and with pitch. She put the child therein and laid in the flags by the river's brink. That's Exodus 2:3. Then on the tablets of Koinjuk, Sargon tells his story. My mother, the princess, conceived me. In difficulty she brought me forth. She placed me in an ark of rushes. With bitumen my exit she sealed up. She launched me in a river which did not drown me. The river carried me to Aki, the water carrier, it brought me. Aki, the water carrier, in tenderness of bowels, lifted me. In appreciation, Sargon named his capital Agadi, called the Semites Akkad, and Akkad was near the city of Zipporah. Now remember that Moses' wife was named Zipporah. Too many coincidences. Portions of the story were also repeated in the New Testament, except that this time it was King Herod trying to kill all the infants to get at Jesus. There are many parallels between Jesus and other pre-Christian godmen, but I don't have time to get into that. We're only talking about Genesis today. It's also important to note that some of the parallels are not accurate. I've read of Kersey Graves, I've seen Zeitgeist. They're both fraught with errors, but there are some predecessors like Dionysus and Prometheus and Krishna that can be positively confirmed. Then we have a discovery, a significant discovery in the mid-19th century, wherein we had 22,000 tablets of cuneiform discovered in Nineveh. And we had George Smith working at the London Museum, who was learning cuneiform and starts translating all these, and he comes across familiar stories. He comes across Bible stories, but it's more than just the names that are changed. It's the significance of the story, in some cases, that have changed. And he found a lot more than just the story of Noah. He found several others, and I'm going to be touching on some of these. Noah, for example, was originally known as Zuisudra in Sumer, Atrahasis in Akkad, Utnapishtim in Babylon, and each of these early accounts vary from each other and from the Bible as well, yet so many verbatim passages are shared by most that they are all clearly talking about the same event that the Bible does, that being a local flood centered on the city of Shurapak at the end of the Jemdat Nasur period around 2900 BC. All three of these myths describe, well, at least two of them, describe the depth of the flood as being 15 cubits, which is about 22 feet. And in the Iraqi floodplain, under 22 feet of water, you're not going to see anything but treetops. And in Gilgamesh version, it's quite a bit more horrific than the Bible version because it describes the water being dammed up by floating bodies as the barges come to rest here or there. And they're, again, releasing the raven to find the land and all. There's so many parallels that it can't be talking about something different. Now, nearby places, you'll have other myths, like in Greece, they talk about the Great Flood there. But the flood they talk about is different because people get to escape it by hiding on hilltops. And other myths, like in China, they don't have the same myth worldwide. In China, they had this one king who lost a battle and he became enraged. And so he went up to a mountaintop and he threw his spear in rage and hit the sky and broke a hole in the firmament of the sky, which let all the water in, which flooded China. And then they had to call the goddess Nu Kwa to come and clean it all up. So there's a good deal of geological evidence for the flood of Shuruppak, but we also have evidence in archaeology too, one of them being the Sumerian king list. It's in 3 copies, one of which is in Ashurbanipal's library. This is an incredibly old document. One of them is a cuneiform cylinder, and it says that the kingship descended from heaven, or when the kingship descended from heaven, Alulim became the first king, and he ruled for 28,800 years. The next king ruled for 36,000 years, and he was followed by a half a dozen others who ruled from 43,200 to 18,600 years each. Then the flood swept over. And after that we have a couple dozen more kings who rarely ruled for more than 1,000 years. One of them only ruled for 140 years. The most recent of the pre-dynastic kings were independently confirmed through epigraphical evidence to hail from 2600 BC. No doubt, none of these guys lived anywhere near this long, and I don't know if it's possible to even calculate the ages in real time. Sometimes you can get the right answer by dividing by 12, sometimes you can get it by dividing by 10. It's a sliding scale. We use a base 10 numeric system, unless we're missing fingers. And they had theirs in this incredibly complex system as base 60. They did not have a 0, and that was one of the complications in their math. So their base 60 system was composed of SARS, which is units of 3600, NERS, which are units of 600, and SOSs, which are units of 60. So you can imagine trying to calculate people's age, and suddenly, what was his, Methuselah, 900, big deal. Okay, in Numa Elish, one of the oldest creation myths ever uncovered. I think it is the oldest. And it tells of creation not in 7 days, but is written on 7 tablets, and details 7 generations of gods. The key one being that the 6th generation created man to complete creation so that the 7th generation of gods could rest. See a parallel there? That theme was repeated in the Epic of Atrahasis, wherein the Elohim essentially said, "Let us make man in our image," and they did, using a golem spell, which is a traditional Semitic spell where you make a clay figurine out of something, and then you either put a spell into its mouth, or you put an ankh into its mouth, or you breathe into it the breath of life, and you animate it that way. And this is a parallel of Genesis 1, because there was a god sacrificed, and then there were 7 men and 7 women who were made out of the clay figurines that were cleansed and soaked in the blood of the sacrificed god. This is as opposed to Genesis 2, where in Genesis 1 you had men and women being created together, and in Genesis 2 you had one man being created by himself, and his consort being conjured as an afterthought by an absent-minded and not quite omniscient God. Remember that the name Adama means man of the red dirt, or red clay. Also in that collection of cuneiform documents is the legend of Adapa, also known as Adamu. The seed of mankind was called before the gods. He was warned not to eat or drink anything offered to him because it was thought that the gods would poison him. But instead of giving him the food of death, they offered the food of eternal life, and he refused, as he was instructed to do. They offered the water of eternal life, and he refused that too. They offered him clothing, and he dressed himself. Consequently, he was denied immortality and returned to earth to put sickness and evil into the bodies of all the people. So, now we turn to Eve. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the wild man Enkidu realized that he was naked for the first time in his life after he had been seduced by a harlot who became his Eve. The god Enki, in another story, trespasses into the sacred garden of Inanna and eats several forbidden fruits. He is caught by the guardian of the garden. Well, it's not Inan in this case, I think it's Ninersag. The goddess Ninersag forgives his transgression and bears several daughters to cure each of his wounds. One of them is called Ninti, daughter born of the rib, for she was made to close the wound to his side. In the legend of the Hulipo tree, Gilgamesh, the god king, plays the part of God in Genesis as he walks through the sacred garden, this time attributed to Inanna, wherein he finds the dark maid Lilith, together with a serpent who could not be tamed, both in a divinely chosen tree. Lilith was eventually cast as Adam's first wife in Talmudic legend. And Gilgamesh took out his axe, struck down the snake who knows no charm, and in the midst, the maid Lilith tore down her house and fled to the wastes. And the Lilith character is interesting in that she was eventually integrated into the Garden of Eden story in two places as a matter of interpretation, much like Satan was as well. At some point, there was a story was that there was man and woman made at the same time, and that Eve, or that Lilith rather, wanted an equal position, and this is the tales given by the rabbis. And Eve wanted, or Lilith wanted an equal position. Adam wanted her to be subservient. He wanted to be dominant, and she escaped the garden because she knew the secret name of God, and that gave her the ability to fly. And then later on, we see that she is making love with demons at the riverside of the Red Sea. And there's all kinds of wild stories about her. But then she comes back as a woman scorned by the younger woman, which is the actual Eve that was created later. And then Lilith is cast as the serpent. Nowhere does the Bible imply that the serpent in the garden was ever supposed to be anything but a talking snake. Yet today it is a common belief. Nor does the context of that story even allow that it could have been Satan. And in the Middle Ages, it was a very different interpretation. It was held by many Jews and Christians. Virtually every Renaissance rendering of the temptation of Eve, from a relief in the Cathedral of Notre Dame to the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the serpent is typically depicted as a woman, usually in the form of a naga. We have a woman's torso growing out of the body of a snake. So, but the Talmud comes later than the Bible, and I'm only supposed to be talking about the origins of the Bible. Many of the elements of the New Testament are found in the myths of Semitic and Sumerian antiquity too. For example, we notice that the notion that Satan rules over hell came from Ereshkigal, the Mesopotamian goddess of the underworld. Basically the same thing as the Greek Hades ruling over the subterranean land of the dead. Originally, everyone who died went to the same place. Then after the 7th century BC, the Zend Avesta of Zarathustra offers a choice of options depending on judgments of your deeds in life. The good and righteous will ascend to the kingdom of justice and truth, ruled over by Ahura Mazda, also known as Ormazd, while wicked men descend into the kingdom of the lie, ruled by Ahriman the opposer. And the Zoroastrian religion is reputed to have profoundly influenced the development of later Judaism more than any other sect. And in Hebrew, the term the opposer is pronounced ha-satan, the Satan. The concept of Satan is a composite of multiple characters too, but again, we're only talking about Genesis here. So, apart from the Talmudic and Renaissance references to Lilith, notice that each of these highlighted elements of the Genesis mythos appeared in a collection of originally unconnected fables from at least 1,000 years earlier, and that they were often written by the great-grandfathers of the biblical authors. Notice also that the modern theme, so critical to Christian belief, is not tied together in any of these. So it is not possible that Genesis contains the original uncorrupted or accurate accounts. The current versions of these stories clearly did not exist in that form initially. Ancient Mesopotamian mythology evidently evolved over many centuries of occasional enhancement, such that the old legends were adapted for and integrated with the emerging culture of Judaism. So that by the time the Phoenicians wrote newer versions of these stories down some 3,000 years ago, the more familiar revisions finally emerged as a plagiarism of previous polytheism. There's also an Egyptian creation myth of the bull-headed god Khnum, fashioning people and animals on a potter's wheel, and then his consort Hecate offers them the breath of life to their clay golems in the form of an ankh, representative of that placed against the nostrils. So, and then this too is an apparent precedent to Genesis 2, and this is where we get to where the gods and spirits came from. The archaeology of pre-Judean polytheism shows that Yahweh, or Yahweh, was originally part of a Semitic pantheon descended from the father god El. Once upon a time, some 2,800 years ago, he was even depicted as having a wife, Asherah, although that may have been part of his unified association with El. El's consort Atharat may have become Asherah just as El and Yahweh were merged together into Yahweh El, whom the Muslims call Allah, the God, and Christians call Abba, the Father. Composite gods were once fairly common. For example, the Trinitarian concept of Jesus shares an identity with El, Allah, Yahweh. And similarly, in the Hindu Trimurti, Krishna is the supreme personality of the Godhead of Brahma, Rama, Shiva. At one time, all of the gods, including Yahweh, were either magically endowed immortals, like the sixth divine generation of Enuma Elish, or they were anthropomorphized elementals, like the river Apsu plunging into his lover Tiamat, the spirit goddess of the ocean. Amun was both at different times, just like with Yahweh. As the deity grew more powerful in the eyes of devotees, the wife became something of an encumbrance, restraining the elemental aspect in human form. Eventually, the wives of both gods were discarded, and the deities followed parallel paths, even though Yahweh was more typically depicted as a volcano god, and Amen was a Theban air god. In his full elemental state, he became invisible, which meant that he could be anywhere, which meant that he may as well be everywhere, which is how you become omnipresent. We feel the breeze move against our bodies all the time, since no one yet understood that air was made of chemical particles, but everyone knew that you would die if you couldn't breathe. Then it was believed that the movement of air was somehow spiritual. Yahweh was granted this aspect as well, so that when Genesis 1:2 said only the Spirit of God moves over the face of the waters, they're talking about the wind. The pharaoh Amenhotep is commonly credited with having created the first truly monotheistic religion. He did it with a composite of two gods like Yahweh El. Amenhotep combined Amen, the air god, with Ra, the god of the sun disk Aten. Thus he made Aron Ra, something that was always looking down on us and who had a spirit that touched us everywhere in the world. Then Amenhotep changed his own name to Akhenaten. His god could be seen and felt. What other deity could compete with his? There are many parallels between many different gods and heroes, so many that it's obvious that the myth makers borrowed powers and adventures from elder lore, which is why Pandora's box reads as a parallel of the story of Eve. It also seems that the Hebrew people exaggerated their god however necessary to make it bigger and badder than everybody else's. Oh yeah? Well, my God can do anything he wants. If he wants a thing to be, he will speak it into existence. It will manifest out of nothing. Something like that. Desert deities were often depicted like a jinn, the plural of which is genie. Early Islamic literature depicts the genie as devious air elementals. They weren't usually confined to bottles or lamps, but were often described as free-roaming nomadic spirits, which is why wandering whirlwinds are called dust devils. There are also strong similarities between the medieval version of the jinn and our impression of God. Remember how Elijah was taken into heaven? In a whirlwind. Such a transition is easy for Yahweh because his name always worked perfectly for an air god. We supposedly say his name every time we breathe through our mouths. And throughout the time when the Bible was being composed, its authors commonly believed that the first breath of a child was when it became infused with the Spirit and thus became a living being. And of course the flood in Genesis 7 was meant to drown everything that had the breath of life. In fact, the single wisest comment I could find in the entirety of the Bible again shows better than any other passage how our notions of spirituality actually stem from a misunderstanding of the natural aspects of air. I said to myself concerning the sons of men, God has surely tested them in order for them to see that they are but beasts. For the fate of the sons of men and the fate of beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. Indeed, they all have the same breath, and there is no advantage for a man over a beast, for all is vanity. All go to the same place. All came from the dust, and all return to the dust. Who knows that the breath of the man ascends upward, and that the breath of the beast descends downward into the earth? I have seen that there is nothing better, that a man should be happy in his activities, for that is his lot. For who will bring him to see what comes after him? That is Ecclesiastes 3:18-22. This is according to the New American Standard Bible, the New Revised Standard Version, and the American Standard Version, and the King James Version all replace the word breath with the word spirit. This translation eloquently illustrates that the gaseous origin of man's belief in his own soul. In other words, it's so much hot air. As for the impetus to change Yahweh's name or his image from the terrifying volcano god that he was depicted as in Exodus into that of a relatively subtle air god, a likely scenario, I think, came from an old Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. Conan the Barbarian argues that my God is strong on his mountain, and his companion, who worships the four winds, which actually was a religion at this time, says his God is greater. His God is the everlasting sky. Your God that sits beneath him. So, what precedes all of this? All of it. Where did all these other legends come from? The common thing that we see is that there's clay figurines involved. So, what we have is people making stuff out of mud. And they make something that looks like an animal, and they become accomplished artists, and then they start fantasizing, wouldn't it be neat if we could just make this come alive? Maybe if we could smash the blood into it or force breathe it and get it to come alive that way. Wouldn't it be neat if we could do that? Then we would be gods. That's where they come up with this thing. And somebody, of course, takes the next logical step and says, well, hey, maybe that's where we came from. And I would say that I believe that Genesis contains no more truth than that. I'm done.